Hello, guys. Welcome. Great welcome to everyone here. I'm really delighted today to welcome you to this exclusive masterclass. And we've opened the session not only to current students on the LSE Data Analytics Accelerator, but also prospective students who are looking potentially to join the course and explore the program. So I just wanted to shout out that if you're interested in finding out more, you'll find some links to the program brochure in the chat, as well as an option to book a call with one of our enrollment advisors. And yeah, so I just wanted to say also, this will be an hour and a half long session. So I think it was advertised as an hour in some places. But if you do need to drop off, not to worry. There will be a recording, and I'm happy to share that after the session, of course. So yeah, without further ado, I think this is going to be a really exciting session today, because it touches on probably one of the most important aspects of data analysis, which is, how do we actually increase our impact for the businesses that we work for? So without further ado, I'll start sharing my screen. And once you guys can see that, perfect, get some thumbs up. Wonderful. So I think before I even dive in to what we're going to be covering today, I wanted to start the session with a little bit of audience participation from you guys. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like for you to put in the chat what your thoughts are to this question. Okay. And the question is, what do you think it takes to be a successful data analyst? So what skills do you think it's required in order to be successful in the role? And these could be many things, right? So like the technical stuff, non-technical. And I just wanted to see where you're at in terms of what do you think is most important for the position, right? Awesome. So I'm definitely getting some good stuff about communication and storytelling, which is a really key part, right? Because ultimately, we're the bridge between technical and non-technical stakeholders. So, we need to be able to communicate the importance of our findings to the business. Curiosity, absolutely. I think it's a great one. I think all good data analysts are curious people, right? Because ultimately, we need to kind of sift through lots of information to kind of find the jewels, right? And it's that passion, as Tim was saying, that we need to kind of persevere, find out more. Tech skills, absolutely. It is part of the job. And it's a big part, obviously, that we cover here on the program. Problem solving, critical thinking, all these things are really, really great. And I'm glad to see that many of you are kind of touching on the key themes that I wanted to explore today. Now, in fact, I think Sandra just answered the question. So I'm going to now move on to the next little bit, which is this is what I think it takes to be a successful data analysis. And really, it's this confluence of the two things. So what we've talked about is communication, and then we've also talked about the kind of extracting of value from data, right? So I've defined it as the ability to translate data into actionable insights, a big emphasis on actionable, to create business value. And so it's that sort of confluence that I really want to focus and get your thoughts on today, because it's probably the hardest thing in terms of being a data analyst. And the temptation, as you know, is to kind of get your heads down in the weeds. But the most important thing is that we are very conscious of the outputs that we create, who our audience are, and making those outputs easily consumable so that we can create impact and ultimately drive value, right? Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is going to be quite an active workshop. So I'm going to go through a case study. So it's going to be case study led. And for those of you that are currently on the program, you'll recognize some similarities to the assignment that you've currently been working on, right? So the two market assignment. But obviously, if you haven't seen that, that's absolutely fine. We'll start from zero for principles. And then we'll kind of work through this structure using the case study as a reference. So the second part, I'm going to be talking about how do we actually frame our analysis in a way that will be understood by the business. And so that's thinking about like what are the business priorities. Then we'll move on to the kind of moving towards business oriented analytics. So it's about how do you create your outputs in a way that will resonate with the business, right? And how do you simplify, for example, your message so that it's very well understood. And then ultimately talking about storytelling, which I know was echoed in just the responses that we've received. And then finally connecting the dots for recommendations that land with impact. And so recommendations are ultimately the crux of a presentation, for example, like a presentation to the business or a technical report or many different analytical outputs. So it's important that we know how to construct them with precision and land them with impact, because ultimately that will increase our value to the business, being data analysts. And then at the end, there will be time for questions. I think what I will usually do is at the end of each section, I'll pause just in case there are questions. So please do write them down in the chat and I'll do my best to go through them during the presentation. But if not, then we'll cover them at the end. Sound good? All right. So we're going to start with a case study. And I'm just going to read through this scenario just so that we can digest this slowly together. And first, for those of you that are currently on the program, you'll recognize the data set that I think you've probably been tackling in the current and last week, which is to do with the Chinook kind of online sales provider. But let's read through this scenario. So imagine you're a data analyst and you're working with Chinook to, well, it's a transactional online digital media store, and they want you to help them understand their customer purchase behavior in order to increase sales and reduce business risk. And in particular, they want to understand these three areas. The first is their customer demographics. The second is which genres seem to be selling best, and does that relate to the demographic? Are there any interesting trends between the two? And then finally, which artists are the best sellers, and and thinking about, is there any risk to the business? For example, if there's a lot of dependency on a few key top selling artists that most of the sales are driven through, because ultimately that could increase risk if, say, one of them decides to move to another label, or like Neil Young did with Spotify and stopped his records being available on that platform, right? So all these things can happen in a real business. So thinking about these three areas, this is what the business has asked us to focus on. That's the scenario. We'll keep coming back to this. So don't be afraid. This is an entity relationship diagram, so an ERD. This is a tool that's used in the industry to help understand the relationship between tables. I'm not going to go into this in lots of detail, but I just wanted to echo and highlight a few key points, right? So key point number one is that you'll notice that you have different rectangles, right? And each rectangle with the blue title, blue rectangle title, and the columns underneath it represents a table. And each table, is an entity, right? So for example, we're looking at a music selling platform. So, we have entities that are related to tracks, so which tracks people are listening to, how much they cost, for example. The albums, artists, genres, all these things, relate to the information, but it's just stored logically in separate tables. One thing that I would point out is, for those of you that have experience in interpreting ERDs, obviously I won't go through this in detail because we've gone through it last week, but for those prospective students, the keys that you can see highlighted in blue, so like track ID, for example, here, or media type ID, these are the unique keys. All that means is that it's essentially the ID that is uniquely defined per row. So there's not going to be any duplicates of this ID in the table. So each track is going to be unique. So, there's no repetition. But then interesting, what I will point out is that you can see there are these sort of links to other tables here. So this represents the bold black text that I'm meaning, a foreign key. And a foreign key just means a field that is contained in another table, which can be linked to, right? So for example, genre ID, we've got our different genres in a separate table. We can link to the tracks through the ID field. So we've got a match on genre ID. And all that means is that it's a foreign key if it's black, because it's not the unique key of the table. So you can have multiple different genres. But in the genres table, you can only have one genre that is unique, right? Or sorry, one unique genres. And that's why it's in blue. So anyway, so just to give you a little bit of familiarity, I'm sure for those of you that are currently on the program, you've already seen this and had to digest it and produce your own ERDs. But we'll be working with this as an example for creating visualizations that have impact and thinking about how we produce our outputs. Okay, so we'll move on to the first section now. So thinking about our problem statement, really. So how do we frame our analysis in line with business priorities? And this is a really important part of, for example, the assignment, but equally, when you're working in business, you need to keep things relevant to the priorities of say non-technical stakeholders in the room, is there always need to be that clear link between the analysis that you're doing and the value that it's adding, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before I even dive in, before beginning work on any industry project, I think it's really important to deeply understand what the business wants to achieve, right, through this project that you're working on, or just in general, the key priorities. In real life, what you do is identify important stakeholders, you'd set up meetings with them, workshops, ultimately, try and extract information from them and get buy-in needed for business action. But obviously on the course, we are not working in businesses, at least not until the employer project. So whilst we're working through the first three courses, you'll be working on case studies. So these case studies are obviously based on real life practical examples, but you're not working in a project as a theoretical exercise. But obviously it's grounded in those skills that are needed for success in the industry. So what's important here is that in place of talking to the business, you need to give an interpretation, right? Or give evidence for your interpretation of the business problem and frame your analysis in relation to those business priorities, right? And I think ultimately it's that sort of visibility of thought that we're looking for, on the facilitator side, is how well have you understood and interpreted the business priorities, and can you translate that into, analytical investigations that lead to recommendations that address those priorities. So you can use a problem-solving framework to demonstrate that understanding and ultimately to link it to your priorities. So for those of you on the course, you covered that in week 1. But I realized lots of time has passed since then, so I think it's worth doing a little bit of a refresher about what that might look like in this case study. Okay, so I've just given an example of one problem-solving framework, but there's multiple different ones that you can use. So I'm sure you've come across the 5 whys framework, maybe even like the 7-step process for McKinsey problem solving. This one is a fishbone diagram, but what's the purpose of this? Really, it's just to give your view to the business of how you have interpreted the problem and how you have identified potential root causes of a business problem. So what's beneficial about this? It gives the business a visual representation of your understanding of the problem. And I think especially in the early phases of a project, that sort of communication is really important, right? So to be able to come to a common understanding of what the problem is and how you're going to address that problem. Because ultimately, the cause of many failed projects in real life is that lack of understanding between both parties, between the people who are doing the work and the client, right? And so that's why it's super important that you have interpreted and have that conversation about what the problem actually looks like. So in this case, we've broken down the case study into kind of 4 areas, right? So we thought about the customers, right? So at the moment, we know from the case study brief that there is no substantive profiling of the customer demographics that's currently available, so they're not really doing anything with that data. They also don't know which artists are popular, and they don't know which kind of file types are sold or most cost effective. So there's all sorts of things that we could offer in terms of an analytical capability. And then kind of thinking about the kind of high level stuff, then obviously the lack of analysis has an impact on the business, right? Because it means that we can't measure risk, which means that we can't create actions to address those risks, which ultimately, increases our, risk of, for example, losing out on revenue, losing out on opportunities, or, for example, losing out on top artists that then leave for other labels. And then, marketing and sales, thinking about like how we can use the information that's available to us from the customers that have bought tracks to target by their preferences, right? And ultimately, if we can create like campaigns, we might be able to increase sales. Okay, but the idea of this is to show your understanding of how you have interpreted the problem. And so this is useful in business as much as it is the assignment. Okay, so we know what a problem-solving framework is now. So how can we write a problem-solving statement, and why is that important? So a problem-solving statement, I think, is a great way of capturing the interest of the stakeholders in the room. So whether that's in a meeting or if it's just like a report that you're writing for an audience, it what it should do is show your understanding of why the business problem is important to be solved, right? And then secondly, how your analysis seeks to address it. And I think it's a great idea to start a report or a presentation in this way because it helps you to align the stakeholder perspectives, right? And it helps you manage their expectations, which is super important. So how do we go about writing one? So I've got this 3-step framework that I think you guys will find useful. And the first step is declare the problem. So if we think about the current case study, we've got Chinook, and we know that it's facing stagnating sales, which is hindered by a poor understanding of the purchase behavior of its customers. And that's taken from the case study brief, with kind of like the rephrasing. So we've declared the problem. So okay, we know what the problem is. So what comes next? State the urgency. So why is this problem important to be solved now? So an example could be to remain competitive, Chinook needs to identify high value customer groups and address its product risk profile. So this is just a way of linking the problem to why it's important to be solved now. And also you can see I'm starting to introduce terms that we're later going to be using in the analysis, such as risk profile or high value customers, which ties into this very last point, of course, linking it to your analysis. And then, an example could be this analysis will address these priorities by, and then ... what we're going to be covering in just a second. So a 3-step way of building a concise problem-solving statement. So what could this look like? So we just gone through this. Yeah, Chinook, an online digital media store, is facing stagnating sales, which limits their ability to respond to market trends. So you can see here, I'm trying to make a link from the case study to why it impacts the business. State the urgency. So like to remain competitive amongst its competitors, we need to transition to a data-driven approach so that we can identify these important metrics that will create value. And then really nailing down this value creation statement is the last part. So linking it to your analysis. So how are we going to address these priorities? We're going to do it by bang, 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 your analytical objectives. And this is what we're going to be covering next. So what is an analytical objective? And I think before we can understand or form an understanding of what that is, first of all, we need to have a better understanding of the data set, right? So we need to do a little bit of exploratory analysis to have a look at, for example, some of the key trends from, the sales or, doing that exploratory analysis that we as data analysts will always do, and understand which metrics are going to be important to the priorities that the business have outlined. And, just stakeholders, just like in real life, the scenario or the people that you talk to in a business, they're not going to tell you exactly how to answer the problem from a data perspective. That's our job, as data analysts. We need to bridge that gap between, the information that we have available and the business problem. So in this scenario, what can we do? We can ask some questions, right? So obviously, if I refer back to the original case study definition, you can see that there's 3 areas that the business have outlined. We've got demographics of customers, genres of music that seem to sell best, and bestsellers and the business risk of total sales for those top sellers. So we need a way of connecting, these themes into something that can be measured, right? Because ultimately that's what we're going to be doing in our analysis. We need to create a question that addresses this intent, but by itself, these bullet points are not questions. They can't be measured. So how do we go about it? So yeah, thinking about what information is available demographically in the data set. These sorts of high-level questions, like how can we think about what high-value customer is, and which fields in the data set relate most strongly to those objectives that we've just seen, the sort of business intent. So thinking about it this way, this is the information that we've been given. We've been given 3 themes, right? Customer demographics. From the case study, or I'm going through the case study example, but in a business, you might not be given that much information. Of course, in the business setting, you could ask questions and with get more information that way. But in the case study situation, we don't have someone to go and talk to. So we need to be, creative in the way that we think about this in relation to the information that is available. So demographics of customers, is that a valid objective? No, because it can't be measured. So how can we create an analytical objective? This is just one example, by the way. And this is one that I've created. It might differ to how you decide to create that, and that's absolutely okay. There's always a degree of subjectivity in this kind of interpretation step. But the important thing is, that we try and interpret the problem through a data lens, that we create a logical link between the business priority and the analytical objective, and that we're transparent in how we do that. Because ultimately, the most important thing here is that when we come to present to stakeholders, that we should be transparent about, the work that we've done, how we've gone about it. And then that gives us room to, for example, be challenged, right? And that's a positive thing. If, they might disagree with a particular interpretation of the objective, that's a great way to have a discussion. And it's much better to have that discussion early on than it is to do it later. Because ultimately, we can fix these small things early in the analysis, but later on, it's much more work. So what have I done here? You can see that I've added emphasis in certain words. So I've added bold for like certain metrics. I've highlighted blue for where I'm trying to relate it back to the business. We'll go through this in more detail later about how to form the analytical objective. But I think the important thing that I want you just to focus on is that we're now getting into something that's more specific, right? So we've gone from this broad concept of demographics of customers, and we've gone to a question that we can provide an answer to, which is, size and average spend by the country of the customer in order to inform future marketing campaigns. So that's an objective, right? And we can measure those things. Okay, let me just go to the next page. Hopefully you can see that. We now think about the second objective. So sales by genre and demographic, which genre seems to sell best. Again, is this a valid objective by itself? No, because we can't measure it. So we need to restate this in a way that can be measured. And the way that I've gone about doing this here is, the same sort of structure. So find the best-selling genre and compare the popularity across different customer regions in order to discern regional preferences and support the promotion of tailored content. So again, this is just an example. You might come up with something different, but the important thing is to try and relate it back to the business priority. And then finally, looking at the last theme, which was about popular artists and their risk profile. We've been given this information in the case study content, but it's not sufficient to create an objective. We can't measure it. So we need to give our own lens of how we're going to measure this thing. And in this instance, I've just said, determining the top 5. So going from best-selling artists to, for example, something a little bit more subjective, like top 5. Obviously, depending on your data exploration that you would have done beforehand, you might decide to do something different. You could say the top 10, right? Or maybe even a completely different measure. And that's totally fine. The important thing is that, you try and make something specific from a kind of vague business intent and document it and make it transparent. And you can see I follow the same structure. So these are all valid objectives. I've got them here on the right-hand side again. So I just want to really get your attention on looking at a few key things here. So each of these objectives start with like a verb noun structure. So these keywords like identify, find, determine. And so these are just great ways to form a concise objective because they indicate action and intent to change, right? And ultimately that just helps you to measure it. So verb noun. Secondly, the words in bold, you can see, are now trying to make that link between the business objective or priority and the data set that we've been given, right? Or the data that's available. So things like best selling, right? So we know that's related to sales, share of total sales, average spend, all these sort of metrics, right? By country, it could be a different one. And so these are now things that we can actually measure from the information given to us. And then finally, relating it back to the business problem. Again, you don't necessarily have to do this all the way throughout like a technical report. But certainly when you're presenting to stakeholders, it's always a good idea. In fact, I'd say it's good presentation technique to remind them whenever you present some sort of objective or insight, why it's important. Because there's never, you can never be too much, you can never have too much emphasis on that important point because ultimately you want to remind them about why your analysis is important always so that they're going to be on your side. Okay, so just going back a step, we created the first two. So we looking at our framework, declaring the problem, we stated the urgency, and now we have created some analytical objectives, right? So what could a problem solving statement look like? So we've got the first two parts, which I've read through before. And then, in your final part of, how your analysis is going to address business questions, you could do this way. So identifying the size and average spend, finding the genre, and determining the top 5 popular artists. And all of the way through, you can see I've used that sort of structure, right, of verb noun, highlighting keywords from the data set, and then also speaking to why it's important for the business. And so we can refer back to these objectives whilst we complete our analysis and indeed afterwards, because I think the important thing here, we've created this problem statement. This is going to help shape our analysis. But the end goal is that we're going to answer these questions, right? So we need to think about these questions that we've defined, these objectives, throughout our analysis. Okay. At this point, I'll stop just to see if there's any questions. I can see that John said something about is there a significance in the color? No, there's no significance in the color. I think it was just a way of showing a kind of, I would say, like a gradient, perhaps from like one hierarchy to another. So going from more specific to more generic. So talking about like department level rather than like necessarily like the customers, right? So that's just a design choice. And the red is just because it isn't keeping the red theme throughout the slides. But also you can use your own colors. Yeah, I can definitely extend the sessions. Very good. No more questions. So we'll talk about the next section now. So moving towards business-oriented analytics. So we've just talked about creating a problem statement and making that data driven, right? So talking about the different fields, relating it back to the scenario. Okay, let's just remind ourselves what we covered at the very start of the session. And that was, what is the purpose of, what does it take to be a business-oriented, successful data analyst? And that is to design with intent, deliberately, those analytical outputs in order to land well with the business, right? So let me just go back to my slides. So in the context of the assignments that you conduct, throughout the course, analytical outputs often change, right? So in the first course 1 assignment, we are looking at a Tableau dashboard and a technical report. But then separately, in other future courses, we'll be looking more at like Python scripts, right? And similarly technical reports. So these are analytical outputs that we need to be conscious of, right? About how we decide to design those so that the people reading them are kind of most impacted by the message, the clarity of the message that we can convey. So one of the important things that I'll talk about is structure. So for example, like if we are creating a Tableau workbook, things like, if you've created 100 worksheets and you only use 4 in your end dashboard, then, consider hiding all those 100 worksheets that are not going to be necessary for the person actually looking at the dashboard. Or ultimately, like in your technical report, if you are looking at different sections, using headers to denote those sections so it's easier for the end user to read through them. Clicked twice there, let me go back. Prioritize. So when you do analysis, almost always what will be the case is that you're going to find so much information and the temptation is to present it all because it might, you don't know what might be the most interesting. But ultimately, the job is that when you come to communicate things, like after this presentation, for example, how many of you are going to remember every slide? You probably won't. what I hope that you'll remember is like a few key frameworks that you can use throughout, your career as a data analyst and indeed throughout the accelerator to, make your work more impactful. And then, you can refer back to the details, when you need them, right? So it's going to be the same sort of thing when you come to present your dashboard, when you come to build um, your reports, right? So thinking about how you prioritize your information so that they support your recommendations, for example. And then yeah, tied to that is your take-home message. So for example, if you're presenting a presentation, each slide should have some sort of key message that you want the user to understand. And thinking about designing that in a narrative-like way so that the user is taken from, the initial steps of the analysis through the key findings and then ultimately to the recommendations, which, will help them to come to a decision, which will hopefully be data-driven and how to say, influenced by your presentation and analysis. And then finally, using visualizations effectively. So in presentations, as much as in dashboards, thinking about what's your key message and the take-home message that we just talked about, and having the visualization really support that message. So it's easy to see from the visualization how your key finding is evidence-based. Right? And we'll go through some practical question and answer type quizzes later on. Okay, at this point, actually, because my slide's gone a bit funny, so I'm going to present this instead, just because it has the right output documentation here. So I just wanted to go through these in a little bit more detail. So when we are structuring our work, so this is the first point, structure. How do we want to do it? So the key theme here is, we want to make information retrieval efficient. So this is not only for your users, but it's also for you because, when you come back to your work in 6 months' time, are you going to remember like everything if it's just a big pile of mess? Or are you going to be able to extract the right information easily? So, structuring your work is a really important way to present your findings effectively and then allow that information retrieval. So when you're thinking about reports, for example, think about like using headings well, legible font sizes, of course, backing up your findings with evidence. So if there is like a key finding, then show me how that is supported by the evidence. So like a chart, for example, in your report. And obviously, if there is a lot of external analysis that doesn't fit within the word counts or so on, if you're using appendices, then link to those relevant sections from your report body. So like if there were like the explicit problem statement that's too long to include in your report, write that down and put it in the appendix and link to it to make it easy to read and easy to navigate through. Okay. Secondly, again, as I said, imagine future you reading it for 6 months down the line. Are they going to thank you for it? So if you were to pick up this work again after 6 months, how easy are you going to make that for yourself? So thinking about organizing your work logically. So for example, in Tableau, you can use colors to group different different worksheets to the corresponding dashboard, or structures. What am I talking about? Like headings, for example, you could use in Jupyter Notebooks, which we'll cover in course 2. Things like removing clutter, of course. If you have code, leave code comments and make that easily understood where you've made a decision. And things like hiding chains to Tableau. Obviously, second point, prioritization. So as I said, we need to cherry pick our findings. The temptation is to show everything, but you shouldn't do that because ultimately in a technical report, in a presentation, if you present too much, your key message is lost. And ultimately, as I say, humans, we can only remember so much. And so I think the important thing is to own your message so that that key thing will be remembered at the end. Cool. And so I talked about a few other things like identifying quick wins. So that could be a great way to build trust. So if there's a key objective, like a really simple way that could improve business outcomes that you've identified through your analysis, then maybe put that first, right? Because that is a quick, easy way of showing your value to the business. And then prioritizing your findings by impact. And then take-home messages. So what's the one thing you want your audience to remember? I talked about this. So thinking about like in your report, write concisely. Use verb noun structures to emphasize action and concision. And then when you create your slides, for example, before you even do the creation step, you should think about what your take-home message is. And then once you've got that clear, design. And then we talked about visualizations as well. So when you've got a take-home message, you might have a visualization in your dashboard that perhaps answers the question to a degree, but might have too many variables on the view, which then confuses the end outcome that you want the user to get to in the presentation. So, one thing that you might choose to do is simplify that visualization in the presentation so that it's more easy to see how your key findings supported by the data. And so often what I say, especially when it comes to presentations, simple is better because we want to cater to a common denominator of understanding, which is often a non-technical stakeholder. Okay, great. So we've done a lot of talking so far. Well, in fact, mostly me. So now it's going to be time for you to do some participation. So hopefully, I hope you're excited. Basically, what we're going to be doing in the next stage is I'm going to be testing your understanding of these four key themes that we've just gone through, right? So, which is all relating to designing visualizations, outputs in a way that lands with impact for the business. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show you three different options. So each, it'll be related to the case study. So we'll read through the case study again. And we are going to have three analytical objectives, right? There's three that we looked at before. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some visualizations that I've designed in Tableau. And I want you to select in the chat which one you think best answers the objective. So you can just type 1, 2, or 3. So in the chat, doing that, and I'll let you know when to do that. Type 1, 2, or 3. There's not necessarily one right answer, by the way. There might be a couple of decent options. So it'll be interesting to see your thought process. And I think the most important thing here is just to think about what are the better choices? So you think about the key concepts of like take home message, for example, what's important for the business objective? Trying to make, in your choice, looking to those principles and thinking about which visualization is therefore better. Okay. So let me, in fact, now I'll go back to my original slides. Hopefully you can see that. In fact, I'll go to this step now. Perfect. Okay, so imagine we've just finished our exploratory analysis and we found the following findings in relation to these analytical objectives we defined. So we found that the US is the country with the largest number of customers and has the largest percentage of sales for Chinook. We've also found that rock as a genre is the best selling and it's also the fastest growing in all countries in the world. And then finally, we found that the top 5 best-selling artists make up 22% of sales. Okay, so these are the key findings. And now the objective here is to demonstrate those key findings in relation to the analytical objectives through a visualization. So I'm going to present to you 3 different visualizations, and I want you in the chat, once you've had a chance to digest them, type 1, 2, or 3. All clear? Okay. So analytical objective 1. Which is to identify the size and average spends by country, inform the prioritization of resources for future marketing campaigns. So thinking about that key finding that US is the most, has the most customers and the most sales. Here's the first option. I'm not going to say any more. Okay. Here's the second option. Okay. And finally, here is the third option. So once you've had a chance to digest those, I can keep going back if you like. I'd be curious to see what you think are the, what is the best visualization for the job? Interesting. We've got quite a range of answers here. Okay, so we've got three. I'm seeing lots of twos. Seeing of quite a few threes. A couple of ones. Interesting. Okay, let's talk about this then. So if I go back. Okay, so let's think about this one. So the first option was a map. So what's the pros of a map? So the pro is that it's easy to spot geographical patterns in context, right? It's obviously highly visual. We're familiar with the globe in general as human beings, right? We look at Google Maps and all the rest of it. We know what a map looks like. So I think when it's relating to geographical, like for example, comparisons between different countries, or if there's a specific location that seems to be really important for the analysis, then I think a map can be a very effective way of conveying that information. But given that the finding here was about the US being just the largest in terms of the number of customers and has the highest proportion of sales, does this map show it well? I would I think there are better choices. And so the reason I think there are better choices here is because, first of all, if you look at the map, there's a lot of, how do you say, there's a lot of empty space. There's a lot of like unoptimized space here that we're using to try and communicate information, but this is very dispersed, right? And so honestly, all we want to show is that the US is the kind of the biggest selling and the has the most customers. We can see it's darker blue, but first of all, for those that aren't necessarily familiar with US geography, do we know which one is the US? Because one of them is probably Canada, right? Am I familiar with which is which? Also, if you look at the legend on the right hand side, you can see that there's like a kind of weird name, right? So count customer ID. This is a classic thing that happens in Tableau if you're using default options. So obviously one thing that we can improve here is saying for example, number of customers instead of count customer ID. And for example, one thing we might want to do is like use data annotation to be able to have that trend more easily captured. So I think this is probably the weakest option, in my opinion, because, for example, the US is a really big space. You might find that in the data, like Spain or I'm just thinking of France, seems to also be quite significant. But because it's a smaller area, our eyes are not drawn to that smaller area because we just look at the big ones, right? And so that can be distracting. Okay, but it's not terrible, but I think it's probably the weakest of the three. So let's go into the next. So what's this one? It's a bar chart. It's one of the pros is that there's a really clear comparison, right? So the chart is sorted. So it's going from left to right. You can see the US, it's the highest number of customers. And then you can see all of the individual countries to the right of it. And it's clear that the US is the highest. So I think it's really easy to compare, and that's a definite pro. It shows how the values are spread as well. So you can see that spread across all the different countries. I think one of probably the negatives is that it doesn't talk about spend. And also, I mean, thinking about an optimization is that you've got all these countries to the right, Sweden, Spain, most of the European countries that occupy a lot of the visual, but don't actually answer the question, which is that the US is the highest. So one way that we could address that is, for example, to group countries by continent. And so, we could have like USA and then maybe Europe, and then see, looking at like the average customers or something. Or we could just like focus on the top 5 countries. But there are approaches to, for example, only highlight a limited amount of the information so that your finding is even more pronounced, right? That US being the highest value. So I think it's probably, I'd say 2 is a good choice. This one, what is the pro? So I think, what's the pro? I think it highlights dominance well. So it shows where the customer base is the highest because it has those numbers. But I think ultimately those numbers are not necessarily very big. So that's maybe another con that it can become cluttered a bit too easily. I guess a good thing about a tree map, similar to a pie chart, is that it shows proportions very well. So it's compact layout. You can see that, well, for example, again, a negative here is that we're using continent instead of country. But you can see that Europe occupies the most amount of customers, and then you've got the US. But the US here is a country, and we're comparing countries and continents, which maybe here isn't the right thing to do because it gives the impression that Europe is better than the US or that US is more important when we're trying to see that the US is actually the most important. So I'd say probably if I had to choose between 2 and 3, I'd choose two because it is more clear from the finding that US is the highest. But there's pros to both. Okay, I hope that was interesting. We're going to do another example. So are you ready? Let's go. So our second analytical objective was we're going to find the best-selling genre and compare popularity across customer countries in order so that we could find regional preferences and deliver tailored content of marketing, so on. Okay, and remember the finding here was that rock is the fastest growing and best-selling genre. So thinking about a visualization that conveys that information well. Okay, here's the first option. Okay, here's the second option. So we've got a bit more information here on the view. Here's the third option. Okay, so of those three, and again, there might be optimizations to be made across all three of them. Which one do you feel best supports that take-home message that rock is the best-selling and fastest growing genre? Let's have a look in the chat. Okay, getting lots of answers here. It's great. I'm really glad to see this participation. So we've got, I think it looks like it's a tie between two and three. Okay, let's go through them one by one and let's talk about the pros and cons. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back. So there we go. One more. Okay, this one. I'm glad that no one really said one because I think one, as you can see, there's a few limitations to it. One, as I think who was it, Victoria was saying that one gives too much information. I think you can see that there's a load of overlap with text, which completely makes the chart illegible. So whilst there's a lot of information there that might be useful, I think there's too much. First of all, we're showing lots of different genres. It's not clear which one is the highest, to be honest, unless if you look at the USA and rock, and that's positioned right at the bottom, right? So in terms of the order of what is important, like where you choose to present things on the chart, it's not very well done. It's illegible, too many data points. So I think one is clearly not the best option. So let's think about two. So what is two showing? So it shows we've got customer country, we've got the genre, which is just rock this time. So we're not looking at any others, which is, I guess, good, right? Because we're not showing that much extra information that's not necessary. We show the best-selling countries by genre, best-selling genres by country, sorry. And you can see here that the US is top, which again kind of talks to the previous finding about about the US, but it's not necessarily the finding about rock being better. So it's interesting here. So there is duplication of text again, which is maybe like an optimization that we could make to avoid having that, or just have like a chart title, for example, that maybe would make it clear that we're talking about rock here. And I think maybe it can oversimplify the relationship because we're just talking about rock. We're not looking at it in comparison to other genres. So I think it does include other information. So I like the use of annotation, which shows that you're looking at not just which is most popular, but you're looking at like the average spend by country on rock per customer, sorry, per customer per country by rock charts or songs. And then the third one. So I think for me, I think the third one is best. Obviously, this is taken from a Tableau dashboard, and this is just a screenshot. So you can see that there are options for interactivity, which is good. You can see that there's a chart title, and it's quite clear, the message here, which says rock dominates sales across all customer locations. I think this is always a good trick in a dashboard. If you want to convey a key finding well, instead of just having, say, rock versus other genres, total sales. Yeah, that's a good idea, for example, Fortini, that you could highlight rock with a different color. In fact, that would be a better optimization. Good thinking. To really highlight that finding. What else? Yeah, so I think the good thing here is that we're actually showing different comparisons between different genres. So not showing every genre because that would include too much information, but we can quite clearly see that in terms of the next most popular genres per country, that ROC seems way higher in most areas. And we're just looking at Europe here because we're limiting the data to a particular view. And so we could choose to do that in another continent if we wish. But yeah, some limitations is that you do get some scalability issues because obviously the more genres you add, the more the bars get smaller. So that's just consideration when you come to the design. Other ones is that some data annotation is missing, right? So we don't actually see like how many sales have been made or what the costs of those sales were. Okay, but I would say, yeah, good thinking, guys. Probably between 2 and 3. If it were me, I'd probably choose 3 just because it has that extra information about the sales and the key finding because it's really hitting that take home message and driving it home. Okay, we're gonna do one more. All right, the third analytical objective, which was determine the top 5 most popular artists and measure their share of total sales to assess business risk from over-reliance on top artists. And we found, if you recall, that 22% of the top 5 artists, as a result of those top 5 sales, they kind of take 22% of the market share of the overall sales in Chinook, the company. So they have a fair proportion of the overall sales, given the number of artists that there are. Okay, I'll stop talking and I'm going to show you the first option. Option 1. Okay. Option 2. Simple pie chart. Finally, option 3. Keep those answers coming in. I'm seeing lots of variation again. Interesting here. Got some different perspectives in the room, which is very good. I'm seeing a fair mix, honestly. I wish I had a poll here. It'd be interesting to see the percentages that are coming through. But I'm seeing lots of 3s. I'm seeing quite a few 1s as well. So I'd say it's probably between 1s and 3s if it were me just looking at the results. Okay. Yeah, keep those coming through, guys. Let's go back and talk through the individual options. Okay. So option 1. So what's the benefit of this? I think this is a stacked bar chart, right? So one benefit is that it shows proportions really nicely. So you can see from the right-hand side, we've got the key. So the top 5 is around blue. And we've got the gray, which is all the other artists. And so you can see by quarter, because it's the quarter of invoice date, which, where the top artists are kind of owning the majority of the sales, right? And then you've got this, also the size of the bars indicates the total sales rather than just the proportion. So it's conveying a lot of information. I think it's space efficient, as I said. One of the negatives, I think, is that it's actually difficult to understand what the overall picture is here, because I think we might be including too many variables on the view. I think, for example, having quarter, so you were using date as a time series here, actually might distract from the key finding that the top 5 artists own 22% of sales, because here we can't see anything in relation to that. We can see that in some months, yeah, the top artists are dominating sales, and in others, there's very little. So it's kind of like not super clear what the key finding is here, if I'm honest. I think it does show a lot of good information, but I think potentially it shows too much, and therefore it's not clear. Okay. Option 2. So what does this show? It's quite clear. It's a pie chart. It shows that the 78% of sales are through other artists, and the top 5 own 22%, which is the key finding, right? So I did do 1, so hopefully you can see that. I have to go back to 1. 1 was this one. I'm just looking at a question in the chat. Okay, go back to 2. So pros and cons. So pie charts are intuitive to understand. It's a very simple visualization, right? And obviously it's familiar to non-technical users. It does show the key finding. I think personally, I think it could be too simplistic because it doesn't include any additional information like that could be useful. And one of the cons that can become a little bit more cluttered with, a couple of slices. But in this case, we're just using 2. So in honesty, I don't think this is too bad a choice if you just wanted to communicate that the 22% of overall sales are coming from the top five artists. But yeah, maybe an option here could be to have, like, if this were a dashboard, have some interactivity, right? So we could have this as like our first view. And if they were interactive, imagine we can click on a slice, and clicking on the 22% might lead to a more detailed view. Anyway, so I'd say it's not a bad option, but it's a little simplistic. Okay, and then option three, what do I think? So let's just talk about the pros. I think one of the pros here is that it actually shows the artist names. So imagine if I was a marketing manager and I was looking at the dashboard, I'd probably be interested in who these artists are, right? Instead of just showing top five. So I think that's a big pro. So we can see which artists, and judging from your knowledge of music, you can probably align those to a genre as well. Most of them being rock, apart from Metallica, I think. Well, Iron Maiden's actually metal. I don't know. Yeah, I have to look at the mapping file. But yeah, most of them are rock. Good data annotation, I think, is another pro. So you can see the artist names clearly. You can see that how much money they've been raising, the total sales, for example, and what percentage of the total that is. So that is a good thing. But one of the negatives, it could be that it doesn't reinforce the overall finding that there were 22%. I guess you'd have to sum the 22, 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 4, etc. That would sum to 22. I guess one thing to improve, you could potentially add a title here. So the title would explain in more detail, reinforce the finding. So I think overall, if I had to choose, I would probably go with three, just because I feel like it does give a little bit more information and it shows that extra, dimension of the artists. But two could be an option if you were to combine it with more detailed information, like in an interactive dashboard. Okay. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Yeah, different thoughts. Obviously, as I say, there's not necessarily one right answer, but there's just better decisions. And so what makes a decision good is just thinking about how it relates to those key principles. And hopefully I've demonstrated that by thinking about the key finding, the business objective, and then also the kind of chart type and the positives and negatives of the information that's shown there. Okay, and then the final part of the presentation, which hopefully I'll go over in about 15 minutes, at least 15 minutes for us questions at the end, is about actually telling a story. And so we've gone through thinking about the process, right? So we started with looking at defining our problem statement. How do we actually create structure on top of like a business intent that tells us to look at areas but is a bit vague? Then we talked about how do we frame our analysis so that it creates impact? So how do we design a dashboard? How do we design our analytical outputs that in such a way that is really clear what our message is? And then we looked at those different visualizations and seeing how they correspond to those four key areas of prioritization, take home message, the design of the visualization, and the prioritization. Okay, now we can talk about storytelling. So, why is storytelling important and when to use it? I think storytelling is important in pretty much all assets of the job. I think in particular, when we present, it's a great skill to have to be able to distill your complex information into, a narrative that can be understood well. And so key skill to develop, in any line of work, but in particular data analysis is, adapting your pitch according to the audience that you're presenting to. So in real life, you might know if you're presenting at a big board meeting that there's going to be mostly like senior execs who might not be very data savvy and are just interested in, the bottom line type attitude, right? Which means that maybe you'd adapt your presentation to be less technical. But then with a technical audience, you might have a very different way of going about that. So the important thing here is to know who you're presenting to. So how can you do that? In obviously the assignments as we go through the course, because it's case study driven, I'd really encourage you to read the scenario carefully. And you can find that obviously on the Canvas pages. But then in a real life situation, it's about knowing your audience. And so I think a good assumption to make in general, unless if you know your audience is very technical, is to assume that there's going to be at least a couple of non-technical people in the audience. And so I think a good way of designing a presentation is that you design it to the kind of lowest common denominator in the sense that you make your narrative understood by everyone in the room, because otherwise you're not bringing everyone with you on your quests to improve decision making in your organization, right? So the important thing here is, I would say just designing your narrative so that it can be understood by everyone. And so a good assumption is that don't assume that they're going to be technical. And then finally, one thing in particular, like in business, but certainly again in the data analytics career accelerator, is when you come to do your presentations, and especially in the employer projects, remember to sell it because ultimately you are the representative of your analysis. And whilst a lot of the work is the technical side of things and the kind of designing of the materials that we've talked about, so much of communication is how you come across, like things like being enthusiastic, things like, for example, try not to read directly from scripts as much as scripts are useful for rehearsing. Ultimately, to get your message across and be influence, to be a person of influence in your business, it's about, how authentic people think you are. And ultimately that comes from, I guess, domain knowledge, experience, but also just presenting yourself as a normal human being and someone that can be identified with. And so that's more easily done when you put your personality on the foreground to, remember to sell it, to, inject enthusiasm when you present. And so I think, what I say, I think, yeah, trying to think about how not just presenting loads of technical detail, but trying to cut through that detail to get across your key message to the audience is a key skill to try and learn. Okay, so one way that we can consider creating a presentation is using a story arc. And in data analysis, as well as in other fields as well, like this is a common way of creating a story, right? So I'm just going to go through like how you might do this. So setting the scene, that's super important. So do you remember when we looked at the problem statement before? That was a great example of setting the scene, right? So we read the scenario, we gave a paragraph of detail about, interpreting the scenario, about why is there a problem and declaring that problem. And then we explained that problem in relation to how important it is to be solved. And then we also looked at, what is the impact? So if we don't solve this problem, what impact could this have on the business? And so setting that scene, it really helps to engage your stakeholders in the room because ultimately you're giving them a reason to stay invested in your presentation. And that's super important because otherwise what will happen is that you get people switching off. And then ultimately that doesn't suit your objectives if they haven't listened to what you want to say. So give them a reason to be invested. And so that comes from understanding the scenario and, giving it your own lens. Okay, secondly, in particular, in assignment one, you'll be doing a dashboard demo. But in general, in terms of presentations, you might be presenting some sort of the results of an analysis, right? So in this kind of secondary phase, you've described the problem. Now you're describing how your analysis links to the problem statement that you've just set. So you're going to reveal a few more details. I think the most important thing here is that you always keep in mind that you're going to be referring back to the business priorities. So you might explain the insight, you talk about some metrics, and you might talk about the change and why that's important, but explain why it's important back to the business, back to the original analytical objectives that you created, right? Because ultimately that's going to make you more convincing if you can really reinforce all the way through your kind of outputs, right? So your presentation, your technical report, why it's important. There's no, I don't think there's any overkill here. Like the more overkill, probably the better, because it just makes, them very clear, like, okay, I see, this is how it links to, these business priorities. It makes you more credible. Okay, oh, too many. Key findings. So then obviously you might do like a summary slide after doing the demo, and you could say something like, okay, so what are the key findings here? What are the ones that I want the business to remember? Which ones are going to be prioritized? So thinking about what we talked about before, prioritizing by the impact, where we can use visual aids. So like looking at the slides that we just did. So thinking about a nice visualization that really highlights the finding, right? And then you can add on top of it with the verbal narrative about how that relates back to the business. And then finally, and probably the most important part of the presentation is the next step. So the actionable recommendations, so especially when you're presenting like the result of a case study, a work that is relating to like a project decision, which is, a lot of presentations and data analysis are related to what's the bottom line here? Like, are we going to make a decision as a result of what you've done? So it's up to you to deliver those recommendations. So I'd say we'll talk about this a little bit at the end in a few slides time. But thinking about how you prioritize those by impact, finishing with your next steps, making them really concrete and easy to implement. Because otherwise, if they're too kind of woolly, then people will forget them. Okay, so a trick that I like using in my presentations that I think is good presentation technique is to lead with your take-home messages. So this, in general, I think it's a good idea not to have too much text on a slide. I know there's some people who might say different, um, but what I would say, certainly in data analysis, is that if you have too much going on, then the key message gets lost. So I'd say it's better to have the key message up front, nice and concisely written, and then to use your verbal narrative to talk about the details, right? So that the key message is the thing that you want the person to remember, not all of the details necessarily, because by writing the details, you're sacrificing the take home message. So leading with your main finding that you want to remember. So here I've said 55% of top artist sales are in Europe, for example, which leaves them way more exposed to volatility. So that creates a little bit of a story about, okay, I thought, well, so maybe, yeah, we need to think about these top 5 artists and their influence in Europe, and maybe what kind of ideas can we think about in terms of recommendations coming from that, which I'll talk about in a bit. One more. So yeah, this is an example of a slide that I've taken from a blog that I actually quite like, but if anything, not that this is a terrible slide, but I think there's a little bit too much clutter going on here. So one of the things, if we're going to make a criticism of this, is first of all, I think the slide title doesn't tell me what I need to know. It tells me like an academic title of, okay, this visualization pertains to tooth decay in adults. But when in a business setting, I think it's certainly a lot more important to lead with most important information first. So, if you look at the bottom, we have to kind of work it out. Like we have to look through all of this text. Looks like older adults are twice as likely, but there's much more decay in untreated decay in certain groups that seem to be these kind of deprived, low-income groups smoking cigarettes than there are in the normal comparison groups. But we have to work to get that information. So I think a much better way of designing that would be something like this. So you have upfront, what is the key finding? Vulnerable groups have 2 to 3 times more untreated tooth decay. All right, I understand. And like you've got the visualization, which is everything supporting that message, right? So you've got emphasis on those groups in bold, so small smoking cigarettes, low income, etc. You've also got the re-emphasis of the importance of the problem, which is that there's unmet need in these groups, which leaves them vulnerable to future health problems, right? So it's really high impacts because, and we're also using a lot more, dedicating more space to the visualization here, which I think is a good way of, getting people to actually pay attention to what your message is, because it shows that it's data driven, right? So again, yeah, so just thinking about ways that you would design your slides in a way that creates impact using these sorts of techniques. Okay, and then finally, last few minutes, we'll talk about connecting the dots for recommendations. So I mentioned that recommendations are sort of the crux of your analysis. You've done all the hard work, you've presented, you have created your analysis, you've delivered the charts. All that work has come to this point, which is the end of your presentation. What is the bottom line? What are you going to recommend to the business to do as a result? Because ultimately, that is why we are hired, right? As data analysts. As we looked back to our very first slides, I asked you that question, what makes a successful data analyst? And it is that you are able to connect from data to business value. And you can do that through recommendations, right? So that's really like your suggestion about what needs to be done. And it's much better to do it yourself here, whilst other people might have different ideas. It's much better to state something up front that leads the conversation down a certain avenue, right? So I said, yeah, the end goal, it's the crux of your presentation. Now, I like this framework when it comes to creating recommendations. So in your presentation, for example, you'll finish with recommendations. In your technical report, you might have analytical recommendations. A good framework to use is this one, which it's called kind of the SICK framework, right? So you can make your recommendations SICK if you use this framework. So SICK, what does that mean? Essentially, it's just 3 key things. You've got specific, implementable, and context aware. So specific, avoiding general statements. If you can, use metrics from your analysis in your recommendation, right? Because that shows that the recommendation is data driven. Um, making sure that the recommendation is actually linked to the work that you've done, right? So it's about making sure that your analysis is leading you to a particular end goal. Lots of people might, present a recommendation based on hearsay or like common beliefs, right? But ultimately, in data analysis, we need to get to evidence-based decisions, which come from your analysis, right? Implementable. So again, really, this is about understanding the scenario and just common constraints, right? So in any business in the world that you work for, I can tell you, even if it's the richest business in the world, there's always going to be constraints, and they're always the same. It's always time, it's always money, and it's always like the amount of people working on a project. So when you make your recommendations, think about those constraints, because even though it's a kind of case study scenario in the example of the assignment we're going to be looking at, there are going to be constraints in this business, right? They're not going to be able to just give, 100% of their budget to your recommendations. So if your recommendation like a wholesale change to the way that they conduct analysis, is that going to be realistic? So think about, is that feasible? And another way of making it implementable is just making it super clear about what needs to be done. I mean, there should be no ambiguity whatsoever about what precisely needs to be done in order to resolve the problem. So being very, as precise as you can whilst being concise. So again, it's a trade-off between those two. And then finally, context aware. Thinking about your target audience. If there are limitations to it, based on your analysis, acknowledging those in your verbal commentary. Okay, couple more slides here. So just got a few more things to say. So again, what was a really a strong recommendation is the ability to combine those different components of your analysis into one. And we'll go through an example of this later. So we've talked about demographics, we talked about top 5 artists, and we talked about best-selling genres. And you can see in this little Venn diagram here, what I think would make a really good recommendation is kind of combining all this information into one that you could potentially use as a really specific, measurable recommendation that would create impact. And so when you use those different dimensions considered together rather than in isolation, it creates a stronger, more grounded analytical recommendation. So I'm going to go through an example with you. In the current case study, we could say we're going to promote mid-tier artists. Thinking about the top 5 artists analysis, we found that 22% had that 20% they own 22% of market share, which could increase business risk if one, say, big seller decides to move to a different label or whatever. And especially in certain continents, we looked at the effect of like Europe versus America and so on. But in itself, is this a recommendation? Well, no, it's not a good one. Promote mid-tier artists. It's quite vague. It's an intent. And therefore, I don't think this is a very good recommendation because it doesn't tell us anything about the analysis that we've done. It doesn't link it to, there's 3 different areas that we looked at. And it's not specific, it's not implementable, and it's not, in any way kind of context aware. So I don't think it's very good. How can we make this better? So a slightly more fleshed out way of saying the same thing but being more specific, is saying something like we need to increase spending on something specific, like website promotions or trending mid-tier artists, so that we can reduce the sales concentration from the top 5. Again, is this a good recommendation? It's getting better. It's certainly better than the previous one, but I still think there's areas for improvement here. So good things, we're talking about specific things like website promotions. We're talking about things that we've measured, like sales, right? And relating it to the analysis we've done, top 5 artists. But I think there is opportunity to strengthen it. So what I think is probably a much better recommendation, and again, this is something subjective, but we're talking about key concepts here. So you might choose to rephrase this in a certain way or place emphasis on a different area of your analysis. But to make this concept stronger, we could integrate more things, right? So we can say, okay, we need to spotlight mid-tier rock artists because we found that, rock is super popular, let's say, in certain areas of the world, and it's the fastest growing genre. So we found out in web campaigns, being specific, targeted at European customers. because we found that European customers have the kind of biggest consumption of rock. In order to stabilize sales against top five volatility, with the end goal of reducing the top five market share or revenue share from 22 to 18% in the next 12 months. So this last sentence, again, it's sort of subjective. Like, how can we really know what a good outcome is here without talking to the stakeholders? And in the example of the case study assignment, you can't really know it because you don't have the stakeholders ready to talk to. But I think the good thing about this sort of approach is that I think, first of all, as long as it's grounded, it's not like super unrealistic, like 22 to 0%, because that would be sort of silly. But we are grounding it in something that we think is realistic that would lead to a benefit in the outcome. And it gives us room for discussion, right? So you say this, if I say this to someone, they might completely disagree with me. They might say, oh, well, 22%, why do you think that's 18%? Why do you think that's much better than 22? Those are margins that can be discussed. But I think by increasing the awareness of this kind of information, the specific information, making it measurable, we make our outputs more likely to be discussed and also more likely to be implemented. So, you can always have that discussion with the stakeholders afterwards. But I think we want to get to a point where we can actually measure and know what exactly needs to be done from our recommendation. So I think there's not really any question here that we know what this means, like revenue share, the different percentages, and it's very specific. It's specific to the genre, the country that or continent that we're looking at, and the particular metrics, so like the top five. So again, there's different ways that you can slice this, but I think the important thing to pay attention to is how we build those recommendations in a way that's specific, implementable, and context aware. So I'm not going to go through this. This is the take-home exercise for you. In the same case study format, and again, I'll share the slides afterwards, how would you go about improving this concept? So this is a nugget of an idea that we need to improve, well, prioritize the US over other continents. If that was your end outcome from the analysis, the recommendation, how would you go about making this more sick, making it much more influenceable, or just convincing to stakeholders? And I'll leave that as a takeaway point. And there we conclude. So yeah, sorry, Joe, just I saw your message, 18%. Again, there's not necessarily a strong reason for 18, but it's just showing an intent, right? So obviously in the case study scenario, there are no opportunities to actually talk to the stakeholders. In real life, what you might do is like talk to, your head of sales and like consider or like do more deep dive analysis on where is the best optimum percentage, right? So again, it would be good to have this kind of data driven, but the reason is that we know that that as a percentage of 22% is causing volatility or a potential business risk, and the idea is that we want to reduce it. And as long as that's in kind of a sensible estimate, I think more particularly in relation to the case studies that you'll be doing on the Career Accelerator, that will be, it's just a lot more convincing and allows you to have discussion with stakeholders as a result of putting something specific rather than something that's vague. Because if you put something that's vague, it's probably going to be forgot and not talked about. So I think it's much better to be precise and to have discussion as a result of that precision rather than to be vague and for it to be forgotten. Cool. All right, that's the end. Hopefully I have captured some interests and made that interesting for you guys. I hope it's been enjoyable. This is now the time for the Q&A. So we've got roughly 10 minutes for any questions. Again, I just need to have a look at the different questions from the chats. I don't see any that are coming up right now, so apologies. I'll be navigating my way through the what you've documented in the chat. So I can see that Joao has said, apart from joining the Accelerator, in your opinion, what's a good resource to learn more about all these processes in data analytics? Well, what can I say? I think, honestly, resources. Personally, I mean, I follow people on like LinkedIn who talk about these sorts of things. I mean, I don't have any like to mind at right now. But I'd say like integrating yourself more in the industry in terms of like, for example, reading certain like articles that come up on LinkedIn or following organizations that you think are really interesting because often there's going to be a lot of like really good content about like how they've done certain things. I think often it's like if you've got a hobby, right? Something like chess, you could do like data analysis on the chess games that you've done. I think often a great way of learning is just taking the bull by the horns and doing it yourself. Even if you don't have an idea as you start, you'll find out along the way. And so I think resources, there's plenty of them. I don't want to get too much into names. I mean, I know I've used DataCamp before. I found that useful. I mean, there's also, depending on the tool that you're using, there's going to be like organization specific resources. But yeah, there's plenty of them. I think the best way I'd say is think about an area you're interested in, think about a project, like about something that you think you might enjoy, and then just go for it. And using obviously like resources on the internet, AI to help you with the implementation, you can create something really useful as a result of that. So I think, yeah, books, there's plenty. Obviously, there's lots of sort of different training websites and so on. I would just recommend going into an area that you're interested in and finding out more. Okay. Yeah, Rita's asking, yeah, will the recording be recorded? Yes, it is recorded. We'll be sharing the link after the session. Q&A, so I just need to look at the. Okay, so if I go to the open questions, where is you? Sorry, there's a few back on the answers. I'm gonna just go through this quickly because we have a bit of time. Christine was asking, where's the USA on that chart? And that's a great question because honestly, it wasn't entirely clear, was it? Because that was probably a limitation of the visualization. But USA would have been these two regions, these kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, the dark blue region just underneath Canada, and then you've got Alaska here to the west, and then you've also got like Hawaii and stuff. But yeah, that's the US. But I think a limitation of it is that it's not very clear, right? So that's something we could think about in terms of how we go about improving it. And then Joe's asking, I've recently been involved in a project where the management needed some insights on how science centers have carried out mobile bus science center projects. From the data I gathered, I couldn't decide on the trend because the majority of the data were inconsistent and each science center had their own actions. So how do I convey an analysis where there is not a particular lead action or an insight to be found? I think this is obviously a challenging thing, right? It depends. There's a lot. It's hard to give you a specific answer without thinking about the implementation and the kind of different data sets of the project. But I think one thing that you would probably want to do if this were a real business project is to think about well, you need to do that exploratory analysis. You need to identify those problems that perhaps lead to the different standards of, say, like the ways that the data was collected, right? And that would just probably need to be a point of improvement. I guess if the data isn't sufficient to be able to answer a question, then I would say you probably need to be transparent about that and lead like as a recommendation for potential organizational change would be like think about how we can standardize the data collection between these science centers so that we can actually find out more useful insights from it. Because I think if it's just a fact that it's unstructured and it's not really much consistency, then as data analysts, there's only limited amount of things that we can actually do with it. So I'd say it's a case of like going back to the business and clarifying and thinking about remedial actions. Data analysis about master is all about programming and resolving problem. Can I have some idea? I don't think I really understand this question. But I think what I would say is that programming is a part, but I think particularly now in the age of AI, right, programming is less of a, how do you say, it's more of an easily acquirable skill because you can find out how code works or how to implement a particular piece of code without knowing anything. You just write a question or a prompt in the AI. So this is why I think this course is super helpful because it doesn't just go about code. Course code is important, and we go over those concepts in the course. But the important thing that we keep front and center is about implementation in the business, because ultimately, that's how we create value, and so that's what the session has been all about. Okay. Do we need to provide recommendations to the stakeholder even if they weren't requested initially? I think, how do you say? I think again, it comes about understanding the brief, and I think part of working in a business is understanding what's expected of you. Typically, when you work for like consultancies, for example, data analytics consultancy, yes, this sort of format mirrors that approach where you're brought in to provide some sort of strategic direction for like whatever initiative the project is. And so typically it is good practice to think about your impacts, right? Because ultimately, if you just come in and do whatever you want, maybe it doesn't actually answer the client question. So the important thing to know is what the stakeholder wants and obviously provide answers to that. Didn't mean that chart. Sorry, Christine. I think it was the bar chart, and then it's just the one on the left. If that's the USA. Cool. And Christine saying, if this was a real project, how do you communicate your time need for the analysis? Meaning that doesn't take too long, meaning not take too long to seem slow, but also have enough space for errors. This is a very good question. And this is something that you probably, well, in consultancy, so I used to work for a data analytics consultancy. It's something that we needed to fight for because ultimately, when you come in as a data analyst, as a, how to say, industry expert in your area, right? Often your clients will not have any idea. I mean, that's why they've hired you about data analytics and what the process is. So what you really need to do is communicate that well at the start about the need for, say, a certain amount of time for exploratory analysis and so on. So I say typically what we did is between 1 and 2 weeks. Is what we'd say to clients. Obviously, it would depend on the project and the scale, but just to give you an idea, at least 1 to 2 weeks of like getting to understand the actual problems so that we're speaking to the stakeholders, analyzing the data set, doing some exploratory analysis, and kind of coming back with like a proposal, right? So often in that phase, you will get a better understanding of data quality issues, missing data that you might need to actually answer the business questions. And then you would come back at a later stage, saying like 2 weeks' time, with a proposal and some recommendations as a like which direction to take it, for example. So yes, communicating the time you need, there's no single right answer. I think it's just important to clarify the importance of that time because it would allow you to provide a better answer that answers the real question and building in contingency for problems. Let's say, often what will happen is that you might have need of the data and the data is located in a certain database and you don't have access to it. And depending on the organization you work with, they might not give you access for a few weeks because, someone might be on holiday or whatever. And that's just things that happen in real life. So I would say, when you come to do exploratory analysis, in terms of understanding the data set better, understanding how the challenges of the data set, I would say what we used was between 1 and 2 weeks, 15, of that kind of exploratory phase and coming back with some sort of proposal about this is what we can actually do for you based on our understanding of the data set as you've given it to us and the business priorities. So yeah, it's important to fight for that time because absolutely, without it, expectations mismanaged. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I think that's all of the questions that we have answered today. I just want to emphasize that if you do want to find out more information about the course for those of you that are prospective, yeah, please find the program brochure in the chat, and I'm sure you can hop on with some of our wonderful representatives who will talk to you more about what's needed to join the course and so on. And then to everyone else, look forward to speaking to you very soon for our final week, and we'll be talking a little bit more about advanced SQL in the next session. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see each other soon.